Hi, everybody. I'm David Marler from Rotterdam, UAS, and I'm here with this knowledge clip on American government, which is covered in Chapter 9 of your book. And our goal is that you can describe the difference between the roles of the American Congress and the American government and how someone can become a congressman or senator and how the House of Representatives and the Senate are organized. And that you know the three different branches of government, and you can explain what checks and balances are. What we're going to discuss in this one really quickly is the Constitution, the three branches of government, and we're going to talk about the federal government and local government. Now, the first thing that we're going to look at is what the term government means. And it's important to remember that in American English, the term government actually can have two or three different meanings. The first thing is that the government can be used to describe what you in Dutch would call the overheid, or which is the federal establishment or the branches and the services that are offered by the state, for instance, welfare or education. Now, another thing that we have with the government is, for instance, the Congress or the legislative branches and the executive branches. All of that would also be called government. And it also includes things like, for instance, the president's cabinet. You could also say Trump's government, for instance. So the word government in American English is an all-encompassing term. And you can see that there would be a difference between, for instance, in Dutch, between regering, kabinet, and overheid. Now, all governments are essentially established by a constitution. And the United States has one of the oldest constitutions in the Western world. And of course, the first three words, you can read up at the top, we the people, is a very important part because it essentially establishes that the rights of the government exist only through the grace of the people. And essentially, the Constitution exists of two major parts. Now, the first part of the Constitution is called the Articles. These are essentially several articles that describe how the government looks, what the government will look like, and how it will function. So it establishes three different branches of government, and then it also says how laws can be made, but also how the Constitution can be made, and it sets up basic rules for the state. For instance, how elections, how a president can be elected, the age of the candidates, the census or the counting of the people, etc. Now, the more interesting part of the Constitution that you'll hear a lot more of in American politics, but you also hear it on the news a lot, is the amendments. And this is actually the second. And it's actually kind of a smaller part of the Constitution, but it's definitely equally as important. And the amendments are actually these changes to the Constitution that we have. So we have these articles that have essentially existed since the founding of the Constitution in the 1780s, 1790s. And then we have the amendments, which are essentially the rights of the people or the rights of the state. And these are changes to the Constitution. And the first 10 that we have are called the Bill of Rights. These were written at the same time as the Constitution. And they essentially give us very basic freedoms. So, and there's actually kind of like a flow to the way that these rights are given. So it starts off with the First Amendment, which is essentially a large set of rights that people have. And it's the freedom of speech. It's the freedom of the press. It's the freedom of religion. So it gives you the freedom to speak, the freedom of thought. And then it also allows you to come together, and it allows you to protest the government. It then moves on to the Second Amendment, which is definitely the amendment that is most contested and probably most controversial in the United States. And that's the right to bear arms, or the right to, and actually it's technically also the right to create your own militia, your own small army, that should not be infringed. But there are also really important ones, and one of them is if you're watching American television and you watch any of those cop shows, you'll hear them do something called the Miranda rights. And the Miranda rights is that part where you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney, can you not afford one will be provided for you. Anything you say, can, and do will be used against you in a court of law, etc. These are not exactly how it goes. But these are the Miranda rights, and these are actually important because they're informing someone of their Fourth, Fifth, and somewhat of the Sixth Amendment, which is the fourth, is that it protects you from the government coming into your house without a warrant. So, for instance, in the United States, if a police officer wants to search your car, that's different than in many countries in Europe, including the Netherlands. He doesn't have the right to unless he has permission from a judge. You also have the right to be quiet, which is your Fifth Amendment. This keeps you the right to cruel and unusual punishment, so you can't be tortured, and you also can't incriminate yourself. And then, of course, you have the Sixth Amendment, which is the right to a speedy trial, so that you can't be kept in jail forever. And then there are also other important amendments that we have. One of the probably the most contested ones, or not contested, one of the most used ones in the courts is the 14th Amendment, which came at the end of the Civil War. It's one of the Reconstruction Amendments. And the 14th Amendment is quite special because, first off, it discusses the right of U.S. citizenship. So it grants every human born on American soil U.S. citizenship. But it also has something that gives people what's called equal protection, which has been interpreted and which is seen as freedom from discrimination under the law. Now, what the Articles essentially establish is that they establish that there are three different branches of government. And these branches also exist in most countries. And we call them the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. We're going to look at all three branches right now, and we're going to start off with the executive branch. And the executive branch essentially consists of the president and his cabinet. And Donald Trump actually has three jobs that we can say. It depends on who you're asking, but most would say 2 or 3 jobs. And for instance, in the Netherlands, these would actually be 3 different people, what Donald Trump does, or the president of the United States, depending on, there's an election coming up. So the first one is the head of state. And the head of state in the Netherlands is, for instance, the king, King William Alexander. And he is the person who is the official head of the country. But you have a second person in a lot of European countries that's the head of the government. And that is then, of course, the prime minister. And this is the person with the actual power. Now, in certain countries in Europe, like France, the head of state and the head of government, so Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, also is very similar to the president in the United States. But in a lot of other countries that have presidents, like Germany, then the president of Germany is essentially a head of state. It's kind of an informal, or it's a formal job. It doesn't really come with a lot of power. And what Donald Trump also is the commander in chief, or he's the head of the military. So what is the job of the president? Now, the main job of the president is that he is the head of what's called his cabinet. And the cabinet members, instead of being called ministers like they are in Britain or in the Netherlands, they're called secretaries. And the secretaries are essentially the people that run the massive government. So the number one job of the president is to run the massive federal government. So all of the different departments, like the Department of State or the Treasury or the Department of Education, all of these departments have to be run by the president and his cabinet, which is secretaries. And so that is essentially the main job that he has. And this job right here, we would essentially say here he is the head of the government, the massive American federal government. Now, the other job that he has, of course, is the head of the state. And here you can see him meeting prime ministers, meeting kings and queens, or dictators, as Donald Trump has called it in the past, from across the world. And he is then the embodiment of the American government. And the third one that we have is, of course, Donald Trump is also the commander-in-chief. He is also the highest person in the American military. So he's in charge of all of the admirals and all of the generals in the massive American military. And he's also the person that's personally responsible. For instance, if the United States were to have use a nuclear weapon, it's only the president that can set it off, no one else. Now, the second branch that we have in the government that is equal to the executive branch is the legislative branch, and it exists of Congress. And here we can see something called the Capitol, and this is the Capitol with an O, and Capitol Hill, and this is what we call then Congress. And Congress exists of 2 different houses. Now, the lower house of Congress is called the House of Representatives, and it has 441 members, and 435 of those members can vote, and 6 of those members cannot vote. And those are from places like Puerto Rico, Guam, the North Mariana Islands, the Virgin Islands, etc. They have non-voting members, including Washington, D.C. They cannot vote. Now, the lower house is elected based on population, and every 10 years a census is held. So 2020 is a census year, which means everyone in the United States is counted. And then in the coming year, they're going to redistrict Congress. So they're going to say certain states get extra votes and other states lose votes. And there are always 435 people that can sit in voting members of Congress that only come from the states. Now, one of the biggest problems that we have with the House of Representatives is something called gerrymandering. And I'm going to show you really quickly what gerrymandering is. So every 10 years, there's going to be a census, and they're going to count the people that are going to be, that live in the United States. And a lot of Americans move around. So especially people in the middle of the country are experiencing a lot of young people in their 20s, sometimes in their 30s, moving across the country. And so they'll leave, let's say, a place like Illinois, and they'll move to California. And if enough people do this, then every 10 years you're going to see California will get extra votes and Illinois will lose votes. That's actually something that's happened recently. So as you can see here, what you want to do when you create a district is, here we have a district where, let's look here, we have a district with 50 people and 60% of them vote for the Democratic Party and 40% of them vote for the Republican Party. And we know that each district essentially has to have 10 members. So the first one that we have here is the perfect representation. And in this one, we can see that there would be 3 blue districts and 2 red districts. And so the blue would win. So you would still have 3, you would have 3 districts that are going to the Democrats, which are blue, and 2 going to the Republicans, which are red. Now, another one that you have is where we start getting into this kind of system that is compact but unfair. So in this case, you would make the districts this way, where you would then have the 5 districts all where the blue wins. And this is a form of gerrymandering, but it's still compact. So they'll still live close to each other. Now, the third one that we have right here, which is neither compact nor fair, in this case, you would have 2 blue districts and 3 red districts, because you've drawn the line in a way to where you've made sure that the people that are voting blue are either grouped together or they're kept apart. And this is essentially what gerrymandering is. And let's look at what it actually looks like in America. So you have these things called constituencies. And so each state has several constituencies. So if we look here, we're going to look at different maps of the most gerrymandered districts. And essentially a constituency, here in Dutch it's called a kiesdistrict, is a group of people that are represented by one person in Congress. And this person can be a Democrat or Republican. And what happens a lot is that every 10 years, the state legislators, so the state parliaments or the state congresses, they come together and they decide after this census how they're going to draw the districts. And if you're a Democrat, for instance, and your Congress or your state government is run by the Democrats, then when you redraw these lines, you want to make sure that it's good for Democrats. So you want to actually draw the lines so that you have as few Republican districts as possible. And this isn't a Democrat-Republican thing. It's actually both ways. So it happens, for instance, the state where I'm from, Missouri, about 30 to 40% of the people will vote Democrat, but out of the 10 districts that Missouri has, only 2 of them, or 20% of them, will actually go to the Democrats, because the rest is quite gerrymandered. And so you can see this right here, for instance. Here you have on Illinois' 4th district, if you look at the top row, the second from the left, and then you can see there Illinois' 4th district. This is a commonly gerrymandered one, and actually here what they've done is they've grouped African Americans and Latinos together, which live in completely different parts of Chicago. And you can see here the fourth, and then you have that these groups are kind of brought together, but these people don't even live nearly close to each other. And then you have the Illinois 7th, and that's the area that's kind of in between. And you can see here that in all of these, you have these weird districts that are drawn, sometimes that are split by several different districts in between. And it makes it to where you either lump everyone together. So Illinois 4th creates a very Democratic district because Latinos and African Americans tend to vote Democrats. And that means that you're always guaranteed that this district will stay Democrat. But you also have, for instance, in Texas, is an example where the Republicans do this, where they'll either dilute a Democratic city, so a city like Austin, which is very Democratic and a very Republican state. They will then split major cities into several districts and then make sure that those districts then go out into the country area. You can see this also right here on the bottom, all the way to the left with Raleigh, North Carolina's 1st district. So you have then cities that are then broken up. So one of the questions that you have to complete for class is to have a look at the gerrymandered districts online, and I want you to look up what the effect is of gerrymandering. Research why gerrymandering exists. Now, the upper house of Congress is called the Senate, and in the Senate you can't have gerrymandering because each state sends 2 senators. And because there are 50 states, that means that there are 100 senators in total. And so the Senate is a much smaller house, and in many ways they have a lot more power because they then also get to provide checks and balances on the other branches of government, and that's something that the House of Representatives can't do. Now, it's important to see that one of the reasons why creating a law in the United States is actually so much more difficult than in other countries like the Netherlands is that both the Senate and the House of Representatives has equal power. Whereas, for instance, in the Netherlands, you also have the Eerste and the Tweede Kamer. So you have, for instance, the Eerste Kamer is also called the Senate. But the upper house in the Netherlands cannot create laws. All that they can do is they can give an opinion about a law and decide whether it's allowed or not allowed. They can say yes or no. That's the only power that they have. Now, in the U.S., as you can see right here, a law actually can be started in either the Senate or the House. And essentially what they do is they write a law, and then first they discuss it in committee, which is a smaller group that comes together, kind of like a work group. They then decide to allow this law to go to the floor, and then the entire House of Representatives signs on it. And then after that, it's sent to the Senate. And then the Senate does the same thing with the law, and they may come up with a completely different law. And then this House and the Senate actually have to come together, and they have to change the law and then send it back to both the House and the Senate. And then they have to vote one more time, both of them all together, to pass the law. And then it goes to the president, and then the president can decide whether it's allowed. He can veto it or not veto it. And it sounds quite complicated, and we'll come back to it in just one moment. Now, the third branch of government that we have is the courts. And in order to understand the courts, we have to look at a few major differences between the American legal system and other countries. Now, the first is that the United States has different levels of courts, like all countries do. So there are local courts. So, for instance, if you're caught driving too fast in a state, you may be asked to go to a local municipal court, so like a city court. You then also have state courts, federal courts, appellate courts, which are kind of like the courts that you go to if you're protesting, you don't agree with the court. And then the highest court in the country is called the Supreme Court. Now, unlike many countries, the U.S. Uses something that's called common law, which is something that we adopted from the English. And this means that we use juries of peers who decide if someone is guilty or not guilty. And it's also important to note that another major difference is that in many states, the death penalty is still an option for first-degree murder, which is premeditated murder. Now, the court that you'll hear about the most on the news is the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is important because it is, of course, the highest court in the land. And right now, the gentleman in the middle who's sitting down is John Roberts, and he is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he will remain the Chief Justice until he retires. Now, if we look to our right from him is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who just recently actually died, and President Trump is now deciding who to replace her with. But the court will always be referred to as the Roberts Court because he is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the rest are associate justices. But in reality, he doesn't have that much power. He doesn't. He's equal to all of the other justices. Now, as of right now, there are 9 justices of the Supreme Court, and because President Trump is replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's a left-leaning judge, that means that the court is going to become more conservative now. And one of the big debates that we have with Joe Biden is that he says that it may be time to expand the Supreme Court, so to go from maybe 9 to 11 justices, because the court needs to be balanced. And that is something that is currently being debated in politics in the U.S. Now, the reason why the Supreme Court is so important is because of this system called checks and balances that you'll read about in your book. Now, the checks and balances is referring to an old Latin term that's called the trias politica. And what it essentially says is that a good functioning government has to actually have these 3 branches that we've been talking about in this video, and that they all need to be equal to one another. So, in the United States, the Congress does not have less power than the president. The president actually is not more powerful than the Congress or the Supreme Court. They all have equal amounts of power. And what they do is they check each other. And one of the things that the courts does, for instance, is if the president does something that the courts disagree with, the courts can rule that unconstitutional. So the courts can say, President, you're not allowed to do this. The courts can also do the same thing with any law that Congress passes. So if Congress passes a law that says that everyone with green eyes has to pay extra taxes, the courts can say that's a form of discrimination. It violates the 14th Amendment, the equal the right against discrimination, and this law is then illegal. And this is one of the reasons why the courts are so important. But the president also has control over the courts, because when a person dies, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg just did, or retires, then it's the president who gets to appoint a new justice, and it's the Senate that actually decides who is whether this person can or cannot join the court. And it's the same thing. The president can also check the legislative branch. So in order for a bill that comes from the House of Representatives and the Senate, so they come together, they agree, they send it to the president, and he can either veto the bill or he can sign it and make it into law. And if Congress says, well, actually, the president refuses to sign this, then the Congress can actually come back and override his veto. And also, if they believe that the president is breaking the law, they can also impeach the president. So they can, and that happened just recently with Donald Trump. And so this is then what we call the system of checks and balances, and you can read more about it in your book. Now, another question that you're going to have to answer for class is how the American system differs from the Dutch system. So make a list of how the American system that you've read about and watched in this video, how it's different than the Dutch system. Now, the last topic that we're going to discuss is, of course, the division of powers. So there are 2 sets of government in the United States. And you hear this because we often refer to the federal government. Now, federal is a term that's used in several countries around the world that have a federal system. And what's funny is that the Netherlands does not have a federal system, but both of the countries that it shares a land border with does. So both Belgium and Germany are both federal governments. And that's why, for instance, in the word Germany, Bundesrepublik, in English, that then becomes the Federal Republic of Germany. And it's the same thing with Belgium, where they have the federale overheid, and then they have, for instance, the local government, or the geweste. Now, a federal government is, of course, means that there's a federal system. And the federal system means that you have states, and that these smaller states have one set of powers, and then you have a bigger national government or a federal government that has a different set of powers. And this is then a division. And as you can see here in this Venn diagram, you can see clearly what the federal government can do and what the state government can do. For instance, the federal government is the only aspect of the government that can declare war, or that can have its own army or navy, or federal policy. So the state of California can't have an embassy in England, for instance. Nor can Montana or New York create their own money. And they also can't make special agreements with other states with regards to like shipping. So, for instance, they can't create a tax that is a special tax on goods that come from one state, etc. And that's called interstate trade. And they also have, for instance, they can regulate things like post offices and ways and means. And essentially, the federal government is in charge of the major law of the land. So the rights of the people are enshrined in the federal constitution. But you have the state government, which in actuality, and especially within Europe, actually even has sometimes more rules than countries like the Netherlands. Now, one of them is that they can create local governments, so cities, counties, etc. That's all created by the state. Education, for instance, in the United States is almost completely run by the state and not by the federal government. Elections are 100% run by the state. So Americans can never go to the embassy to vote because the federal government doesn't conduct elections. That's done by the individual states. Things like public safety, for instance, the police, etc., that's all run by the state and the local governments. And they also regulate statewide trade, so they can even make rules, for instance, on what kind of education a barber or a hairdresser needs. They can also issue licenses. So one thing that you notice is that a teacher in one state cannot just move and become a teacher in another state because they have to have a license. And it's the same thing with, for instance, a driver's license. If someone from Missouri moves to California, they may have to retake their driving test. And everything that's not mentioned in the Constitution essentially becomes the right of the state. And then there are powers that the government share. So, for instance, they have taxes, courts. They can both borrow money. They can make laws about welfare, and they can also build public works. So, for instance, highways or bridges can either be built by the federal government or the state or local governments. And so that's why you'll have in certain states federal parks, and you'll also have state parks. So there are different governments, and that's quite different than in a country like the Netherlands, where the national government in The Hague actually has the powers centralized there, and that's not the case in the United States. This is the end of this lecture. I hope that you've learned something from it, and make sure to finish the questions and bring them to class. Have a great day.